Opening the center swiftly, this pawn dash immediately fights for crucial central squares, influencing the game's direction from the very first step. Opening the French defense creates a solid pawn chain and prepares for a strategic battle in the center. Asserting central dominance, d4 immediately stakes a claim for space and prepares rapid piece development. Challenging the center immediately creates an unbalanced position ripe for dynamic play. Anchoring the center, this knight prepares for pawn advances while potentially eyeing black's d5 pawn. Instantly challenging the center, this knight development is a fundamental principle, preparing for kingside castling while contesting key squares. Pinning the knight here immediately challenges black's central pawn structure and restricts piece mobility. Relinquishing the center's pawn allows white to seize more space and potentially launch an aggressive kingside attack. Recapturing with the knight immediately reestablishes material equality and central presence, setting the stage for dynamic play. Developing the bishop to a solid square prepares for castling, solidifying black's central presence. Disrupting black's pawn structure and creating an immediate doubled pawn is the main idea here, weakening their kingside pawn cover and potentially opening lines for future piece activity. Opening the g-file, albeit at the cost of doubling your pawns, now gives your kingside a unique attacking potential and creates immediate pressure on the center. Solidifying the kingside pawn structure and preparing for a kingside fianchetto, this move opens diagonals for your bishop and aims to control more central space. Developing the bishop to the diagonal offers a better outpost for piece activity and supports the pawn structure. Pushing the knight to f3 solidifies the center and prepares for castling kingside, aiming to connect the rooks and activate the queenside. This move quietly develops a piece towards its natural square, improving piece coordination and indirectly threatening black's pawn structure should it become overextended. Sharpening the development of that dark-squared bishop, the piece now eyes the queenside and offers better defensive coverage for black's king, a pragmatic response to white's pawn chain and potential kingside advances. Unifying the rooks and preparing to castle queenside, white also indirectly pressures black's undeveloped kingside. Challenging white's central control with an ambitious pawn thrust, black immediately targets the e4 knight and aims to disrupt white's pawn structure, though this opens a diagonal towards the king. Solidifying the knight's position here frees up the f-pawn for potential advancement, while also preparing for a queenside expansion or a central push, aiming to exploit black's slightly compromised pawn structure around their king. Exposing the king's avenues of escape, this development simultaneously obstructs your own pawns, creating a somewhat cramped position. Consider how the g7 pawn, now unshielded by its e-pawn, might become a target, and whether those active bishops can truly coordinate effectively from their current, somewhat passive, squares. Solidifying the queenside pawn structure with c3 aims to prevent black's knight from hopping into the d4 square, and simultaneously prepares to expand on the queenside, potentially with b4, should black's central pressure ease. Reclaiming central square control, black repositions the queen to a more active diagonal, ready to support the kingside and potentially contest the e-file. Reclaiming the active diagonal for the king's bishop, while simultaneously preparing to castle kingside, this maneuver addresses the somewhat passive placement of the bishop on g2 after the previous sequence. It aims to consolidate white's position and build towards a safer haven for the monarch, creating a solid pawn structure on the kingside. Developing the knight to d7, this move, while seemingly passive, sets the stage for a fluid reshuffling of black's pieces. It vacates the e7 square, potentially allowing the queen to reposition, and also clears the path for the c8 bishop to enter the game later. The knight on d7 acts as a centralizing outpost, ready to swing over to f6 or even e5 if the opportunity arises, adding flexibility to black's nascent queenside development and bolstering the pawn chain's defensive integrity. Castling now secures the white king behind a newly formed pawn shield, a prudent step given the central pawn structure and black's developing pieces. The black king, finally tucked away behind a pawn shield, finds a measure of safety, but the pawn structure on the king side now presents permanent weaknesses that might be exploited later. The rook now ventures to the e-file, aiming to support the d4 pawn and potentially create pressure on the black king's defenses, especially if the e-file opens later. Reclaiming the e-file with the rook after a period of regrouping aims to solidify central influence and prepares for potential pawn advances, or even an early initiative. This maneuver seeks to gain queenside territory and potentially open lines for the rook, though it comes with a risk of creating weaknesses if black can effectively counterattack on the queen side. Securing the queenside initiative, black's pawn advance to a6 prepares to challenge white's bishop on b4 and simultaneously creates a crucial escape square on b7 for the bishop, should it become attacked or exchanged. This move subtly begins to contest white's queenside space advantage and aims to disrupt the harmony of white's pawn structure, particularly the potential for a b5 push later. Pressing the queenside pawn advances the initiative, aiming to pry open the file for rook infiltration and potentially create a passed pawn, while simultaneously restricting black's knight's usual entry points. Unlocking the queenside pawn chain, this advance prepares to challenge white's queenside space advantage, aiming to create counterplay along the b-file and potentially open up lines for black's pieces. Challenging black's pawn chain on the queenside, this knight maneuver aims to disrupt coordination and potentially open lines for white's pieces, while simultaneously bolstering the central pawn structure and offering a tactical retreat for the knight if necessary. The bishop retreats to a more active square, eyeing the d3 pawn and preparing to contest the central d-file, while also keeping an eye on the king side. Reinforcing the central pawn chain and preparing to contest the d-file with potential long-term pressure. Asserting control over the central open file immediately, black repositions the rook to confront white's d4 pawn and open lines for potential action, preparing for a more active presence on the d-file while subtly eyeing the g2 bishop's influence. Initiating an aggressive kingside pawn thrust with g4 dramatically alters the tactical landscape, aiming to shatter black's defensive pawn structure and expose the king. Safeguarding the king by shifting it to the h8 square is a prudent defensive maneuver, anticipating a potential storm of white pawns advancing on the king side, and aiming to create an escape route along the h-file if necessary. Recentralizing the knight after its earlier foray to the queenside aims to bolster the kingside defense and prepare for a potential kingside pawn storm. Black finally breaks the symmetry, opening lines in the center and creating a pawn sacrifice that might just unleash the bishop on g7. This daring pawn grab fundamentally alters the pawn structure, potentially offering a much-needed antidote to white's queenside expansion and initiating a more dynamic, less predictable phase of the game. The immediate consequence is the doubling of white's pawns on the g-file, a target for black's advancing pieces, while black's own king, though safer on the king side for now, might find itself exposed if white can effectively exploit the open diagonals and files that are starting to appear. Liberating the c4 knight from its restrictive diagonal now allows it to eye central squares, potentially reinforcing the d4 pawn and preventing a deep black pawn thrust. Accepting the pawn sacrifice with fxg4 fundamentally alters the pawn structure on the king side, opening a diagonal for your bishop and potentially creating tactical threats, but it also allows white's king to potentially become more active later. Unveiling a hidden diagonal, this bishop sacrifice immediately challenges black's reinforced center and opens a swift path for white's remaining forces toward the enemy king. The immediate threat to white's king, forcing a reshuffle of his defensive pieces, is the primary justification for this checking maneuver. Seeking immediate king safety, white prioritizes tucking the monarch away on the king side, a necessary precaution given black's active rook and the newly opened diagonal towards white's kingside weaknesses. This maneuver aims to shield the king from further tactical incursions and prepare for potential defensive maneuvers, while implicitly acknowledging the precariousness of the current position. The black bishop, no longer under direct threat, retreats, but this creates a pawn weakness on the queen side by the advance of the c-pawn. White should look to exploit the open g-file and the exposed black king by bringing more pieces into the attack. A crucial exchange that clears a path for the rook and addresses the nagging knight on d2, simultaneously opening up the e-file for potential counterplay, though it does concede the bishop pair and simplifies into a more open position where pawn weaknesses might become more pronounced for black if not careful. Reclaiming the knight opens lines and prepares for an active central presence, potentially challenging white's pawn structure and influencing the fate of the d-file. Unlocking the c-file for the rook and rook battery offers significant attacking potential, but it comes at the cost of black's potentially compromised queenside pawn structure. Reclaiming the open c-file with the rook signals an immediate shift towards active piece play, aiming to disrupt white's central grip and potentially exploit the king's somewhat exposed position, creating dynamic counterplay. Launching an aggressive pawn thrust along the queenside aims to disrupt black's coordination and potentially open lines for white's pieces. Opening the file, black immediately challenges white's central pawn structure and aims to activate their rook, creating dynamic play. Opening the queenside now allows white to seize control of the semi-open file, a crucial strategic advantage in this position, potentially leading to pressure on black's queenside structure if black isn't careful with their pawn advances. The rook's descent to the 5th rank dramatically alters the pawn structure, creating immediate threats along that now open highway and forcing white's pieces to reassess their defensive duties. Unleashing the d-pawn, white aims to shatter the pawn chain and open lines towards black's vulnerable king, a bold gambit for central dominance. The black queen's foray to the center, directly challenging white's pawn majority on the queenside, signifies an immediate shift towards active counterplay, aiming to disrupt white's advancing pawns and potentially create weaknesses around the king. Unleashing a sudden pawn thrust, this gambit opens critical diagonal lines and challenges black's central control, forcing an immediate reaction to prevent further positional concessions. The black queen, emboldened by the exposed king position, dives into the fray, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially force an exchange that benefits black's material advantage in the long run, even if it means temporarily sacrificing a rook. Unlocking the queenside pawn structure with this capture forces a reevaluation of black's defensive setup, creating potential weaknesses around the isolated pawns now that the b-file is open. Spotting an unprotected enemy piece, black pounces with their knight, aiming to disrupt white's queenside pawns and create tactical complications around the pinned rook. Securing the d4 square becomes paramount, as this allows the rook to penetrate the crucial open files, eyeing black's weakened king position and potentially initiating an assault. A desperate check, forcing a sequence that will lead to a material imbalance, but perhaps creating some counterplay with the exposed white king and the tied-up pieces. Unleashing a desperate attempt to shake loose the compromised queenside structure, white offers a pawn sacrifice to disrupt black's regal control and pry open diagonal lines for potential counterplay. Sacrificing material to activate the rook and challenge the open file, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially create counterplay. The attempt to simplify into a favorable endgame by sacrificing the pawn on f7 immediately backfires, as the unleashed attack on white's castled king becomes the paramount concern, overshadowing any minor material advantage gained. Re-establishing queen activity proves paramount after the dramatic exchange on the kingside, aiming to exploit any lingering awkwardness in white's pawn structure. Sacrificing the rook opens lines for your remaining pieces and aims to force an exchange, simplifying towards an endgame where your king might be safer, though it leaves you a piece down.